In the heart of the Horn of Africa lies Ethiopia, an ancient empire, a land of faith, resilience, and unbroken sovereignty. Unlike much of the continent, Ethiopia stood defiant, proud, and free when European powers carved Africa into colonies. But in the 1930s, this independence would face its greatest test. For Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, the dream of empire was not a choice, it was an obsession. Italy, humiliated in the late 19th century after its defeat at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, burned with a desire for revenge. Adwa had been the battle that stunned the world, when Ethiopian warriors defeated one of Europe's modern armies, shattering the myth of white invincibility. For decades later, Mussolini vowed to erase that shame. Ethiopia in the 1930s was a tapestry of tradition and transition. Emperor Haile Selassie, crowned in 1930, sought to modernize his nation while holding fast to ancient customs. He built schools, introduced a constitution, and slowly expanded the army. Yet Ethiopia was still a land of contrasts, nobles wielding regional power, peasants bound to feudal obligations, and warriors carrying rifles alongside spears. To many Ethiopians, independence was sacred, protected not just by steel, but by faith. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church proclaimed their land was chosen, shielded by God. But beyond their mountains, storms were gathering. In Italy, Mussolini promised a new Roman Empire, an empire to restore national pride and spread fascist glory. His eyes turned to Africa. Libya was already under Italian control, but it had been a costly and brutal conquest. Eritrea and Somaliland were footholds on the Horn, yet incomplete. Ethiopia stood in the middle, a symbol of resistance, and an insult Mussolini could not tolerate. To the fascists, Ethiopia was not just territory, it was redemption. Mussolini believed conquest would cement his power, give Italy access to resources, and prove to Europe that fascism was strong. By the 1930s, nearly all of Africa was under European control. Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, all had carved up the continent. Ethiopia was one of the last free nations, alongside Liberia. To Africans across the continent, Ethiopia was more than a country, it was a beacon of hope. Its independence symbolized resistance against foreign domination. As tensions grew, the world watched closely. The League of Nations, formed after the First World War to ensure peace, was meant to prevent aggression. But as Italy's intentions became clear, the League hesitated. Britain and France, themselves colonial empires, were reluctant to challenge Mussolini too harshly. They feared driving him closer to Adolf Hitler in Germany. Mussolini understood this. He knew the world's silence would be his greatest weapon. In Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie and his government prepared for the storm. He called upon his people to defend their homeland, to fight for their freedom. For Ethiopia, war would not only be about survival, but about dignity. And so, the seeds of conflict were sown. On one side, a fascist empire determined to erase past humiliations. On the other, an ancient kingdom, proud and defiant, determined to defend its sovereignty. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic struggles in modern history, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. After the Great War, Europe was scarred. Italy, though among the victors, felt cheated. Promises of new lands went unfulfilled. Economic crisis, unemployment, and political chaos gripped the nation. Amid despair, one man rose to power, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, once a socialist journalist, reinvented himself as the prophet of fascism. He promised strength, order, and greatness. In 1922, as his black shirts marched on Rome, King Victor Emmanuel III handed Mussolini the keys to power. From then on, Italy would walk a path of dictatorship. Fascism was more than politics, it was theater, it was spectacle. Through parades, slogans, and rigid control, Mussolini shaped Italy into a nation that worshipped his image. To the world, he styled himself as Il Duce, the leader who would resurrect the glory of Rome. For Mussolini, domestic control was not enough. He needed conquest, empire, and glory. Italy already held colonies in Libya, Eritrea, and Somaliland, but to rival Britain and France, Mussolini wanted more. Ethiopia, the prize denied to Italy in 1896, became the ultimate target. Conquest, Mussolini argued, was Italy's destiny. Ethiopia would be Italy's crown jewel, a land of resources, prestige, and proof that fascism could restore Roman greatness. The 1930s were years of preparation. Italy poured money into modernizing its army, producing tanks, artillery, and poison gas. Its air force expanded into one of the largest in Europe. Meanwhile, propaganda painted Ethiopia as a backward land in need of civilization, justifying war in the name of progress. The generals were eager. Graziani, known for his ruthless campaigns in Libya, saw Ethiopia as another chance to cement his reputation. Badoglio, a cunning strategist, believed victory was inevitable. In Italy, Mussolini's personality cult grew. Children were taught to praise him. Farmers and workers were told they labored for the glory of the Duce. The press echoed his words without question. In this atmosphere, war was not just policy, it was destiny. Mussolini's genius was to convince Italians that Ethiopia was theirs by right. He exploited old wounds from Adwa and fueled a hunger for revenge. It became less about Ethiopia itself, and more about proving Italy's strength to the world. Beyond Italy, the world was shifting. Adolf Hitler was consolidating power in Germany, challenging the fragile peace of Europe. Britain and France, still haunted by the bloodshed of the First World War, hesitated to confront rising dictators. This silence gave Mussolini confidence. He believed the world would do nothing to stop him. And for the most part, he was right. Propaganda framed the coming war as a civilizing mission. Italians were told Ethiopia was a land of savages, a blank canvas for Rome's return. Newspapers spoke of Ethiopia's gold, cattle, and fertile soil as treasures waiting to be claimed. Ordinary Italians, struggling under economic hardship, were promised jobs, land, and pride from conquest. For Mussolini, war was also a distraction, from unemployment, from dissent, from the cracks within fascism itself. By the mid-1930s, the pieces were in place. Hundreds of thousands of Italian troops poured into Eritrea and Somaliland. Tanks rumbled across the desert. Warplanes circled overhead. The Duce was ready. And yet, this was not merely a military campaign. It was theater, spectacle, and ideology. Mussolini would present himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In Rome, he declared Italy's mission was to bring civilization to Africa. And so, the fascist dream of empire sharpened its teeth. Mussolini, the self-proclaimed new Caesar, prepared to march against one of the last free nations in Africa. In his vision, Ethiopia would fall quickly, crushed under the weight of modern arms. But Ethiopia was no ordinary foe. You've just watched another powerful chapter from the Chronicles of African Wars. If you love Africa's untold stories, of courage, empire, and resistance, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next battle, the next hero, or the next moment that shaped our continent's destiny. This is the Chronicles of African Wars, bringing history to life, one story at a time. In 1930, Ras Tafari Makonnen ascended to the throne as Emperor Haile Selassie I. His coronation was a spectacle of faith and tradition, witnessed by dignitaries from across the world. For Ethiopians, he was more than a ruler, he was the defender of their independence, the guardian of their faith, the king of kings. Haile Selassie was a man of contrasts, rooted in ancient Ethiopian tradition, yet determined to modernize his nation. He inherited a kingdom proud but vulnerable, independent yet facing the storms of a new world order. Ethiopia's greatest strength was its history. For over 2,000 years, the Ethiopian Empire had survived invasions, civil wars, and famines. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church gave the nation unity of faith, while its geography, towering mountains, deep valleys, and rugged plains, made conquest difficult. Her people were fiercely proud. To them, independence was sacred. They remembered Adwa, where Ethiopian warriors had once defeated Italy. That memory still burned, ready to inspire a new generation. But Haile Selassie also knew Ethiopia's weaknesses. The nation's army was brave, but outdated. Many soldiers still carried spears and swords, while others used old rifles from the First World War. Ethiopia lacked modern tanks, heavy artillery, and an air force. Against Italy's industrial power, Ethiopia seemed ill-prepared. Haile Selassie was not blind to these challenges. From the moment he took the throne, he worked to modernize Ethiopia. He built schools, hospitals, and roads. He introduced a constitution in 1931, limiting the power of nobles and centralizing authority under the crown. He sent students abroad to learn engineering, medicine, and military science. He imported rifles and a handful of aircraft. He sought to unify the nation under a single flag, one voice, one destiny. Yet, Ethiopia remained divided. Powerful nobles, or ras, commanded their own armies and often pursued local interests above national unity. Some resisted Haile Selassie's reforms, fearing a loss of power. The emperor faced the challenge of welding a patchwork empire into a modern nation, just as Mussolini prepared to strike. Haile Selassie understood the power of diplomacy. He reached out to Europe, signing treaties, joining the League of Nations, and assuring the world Ethiopia was a civilized nation deserving of respect. In his speeches, he reminded Europe that Ethiopia was not a colony to be divided, but a sovereign empire. Haile Selassie was very strategic. He believed international law, and the League of Nations in particular, would protect Ethiopia. What he did not fully grasp was that the League was weak, and that colonial powers would not risk much to defend an African state. In the early 1930s, as Mussolini's ambitions grew clearer, Ethiopia began to prepare. Men from every corner of the empire were called to arms. Tens of thousands answered, bringing rifles, spears, and faith. They carried charms and talismans, convinced that divine protection would shield them from bullets and bombs, but while courage ran deep, the gap between modern Italian weaponry and Ethiopia's resources was vast. Haile Selassie knew faith alone could not win this war. By 1934, reports of Italian military buildup reached Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations for assurances of peace. But he also prepared his people for war. Across Ethiopia, drums of resistance began to sound. The nation braced itself for the storm. Ethiopia, proud and ancient, stood at a crossroads. With one hand, Haile Selassie reached for the modern world. With the other, he held tightly to the traditions of his ancestors. Yet as the emperor struggled to unite and strengthen his nation, Mussolini's war machine gathered on the horizon. The collision of these two worlds was inevitable. You've just watched another powerful chapter from the Chronicles of African Wars. If you love Africa's untold stories, of courage, empire, and resistance, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next battle, the next hero, or the next moment that shaped our continent's destiny. This is the Chronicles of African Wars, bringing history to life, one story at a time. In late 1934, in the remote desert of Ogaden, a clash erupted that would set the world ablaze. At Wal Wal, a dusty oasis claimed by both Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland, rival patrols met. What began as a border dispute would become the match that lit Mussolini's war. The frontier between Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland had long been disputed. Neither side had clearly defined boundaries. Ethiopian patrols moved across the desert, asserting their sovereignty, while Italian forces, entrenched in Somaliland, built forts and roads deeper into contested land. On December 5, 1934, the standoff erupted into gunfire. Both sides accused the other of firing the first shot. The skirmish left dozens dead, Ethiopians and Italians alike. But more than blood was spilled that day. Diplomacy collapsed, and war became inevitable. The Wal Wal incident was small in scale, but vast in consequence. Mussolini seized on it as the excuse he had been waiting for. In Rome, Mussolini thundered against Ethiopia. He painted the clash as Ethiopian aggression, claiming Italian soldiers had been attacked without provocation. Italian newspapers screamed for revenge. Fascist propaganda portrayed the Ethiopians as savages who needed to be crushed. In Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie acted swiftly. He protested to the League of Nations, insisting Ethiopia had been attacked on its own soil. He pleaded for mediation, hoping international law would restrain Mussolini. The League investigated, but its response was weak. Britain and France, both wary of Mussolini drifting closer to Hitler, hesitated to confront Italy with real force. Sanctions were discussed, but little action was taken. Ethiopia's faith in the League began to crumble. The League of Nations had the chance to stop Mussolini early. Instead, it hesitated. That hesitation gave Mussolini all the encouragement he needed. By 1935, Italy had mobilized over 400,000 troops in Eritrea and Somaliland. Tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft poured into Africa. For Mussolini, this was no border skirmish, it was a full-scale conquest in the making. General Emilio de Bono would command the invasion from the north, advancing from Eritrea. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani would strike from the south, out of Somaliland. Both were ruthless, determined, and backed by overwhelming firepower. In Ethiopia, Haile Selassie called upon his people. He urged every able-bodied man to take up arms. Tens of thousands answered the call. Some carried rifles, many carried spears, but all carried faith in their emperor and their God. The world stood on the edge of a new war. At Wal Wal, a small spark had been struck, but its flames spread quickly. Mussolini would not back down, and Haile Selassie would not surrender. In October 1935, Italy's invasion began, the clash of modern empire against ancient nation. Wal Wal was more than a border dispute. It was the final thread cut between peace and war. From that desert oasis, history surged forward. The invasion of Ethiopia had begun. The League of Nations was born from the ashes of the First World War, a promise to humanity that never again would unchecked aggression plunge the world into chaos. But when Mussolini turned his gaze on Ethiopia, the League's lofty ideals collided with harsh political realities. What followed would expose its weakness, its hypocrisy, and its ultimate failure. After the Wal Wal incident, Haile Selassie appealed directly to the League. Ethiopia was a member state, entitled to protection under its covenant. The emperor trusted that the international community would stand against Mussolini's aggression. But in Geneva, Ethiopia's voice was small compared to the thunder of Europe's great powers. Britain and France controlled the stage, and their colonial empires in Africa made them uneasy about siding fully with Ethiopia. In London and Paris, the crisis was debated fiercely. Britain controlled vast colonies in East Africa. France sought Italy's cooperation against the growing threat of Nazi Germany. Neither wanted to push Mussolini too hard. Both feared driving him into Hitler's embrace. In these calculations, Ethiopia became a bargaining chip, its sovereignty weighed against European security. In October 1935, after Italy's invasion began, the League condemned Mussolini's aggression. Economic sanctions were imposed, but they were incomplete, designed more for show than effect. Oil, steel, and coal, the lifeblood of Mussolini's war machine, were deliberately excluded from the sanctions list. Without oil sanctions, Mussolini's planes flew, his tanks rolled, and his armies advanced. The sanctions were a shield made of paper. Behind closed doors, betrayal brewed. In late 1935, British and French diplomats secretly drafted the Laval Pact. Their plan, give Mussolini 2/3 of Ethiopia in exchange for peace. It was a deal that would reward aggression, and strip Ethiopia of its independence. When the plan leaked to the press, public outrage in Britain forced it to collapse. But the damage was done. Ethiopia now saw clearly, the League would not save it. Mussolini mocked the League's condemnations. Italian newspapers ridiculed sanctions. He reminded his people that Rome once ruled the world, and under fascism, it would do so again. Far from being deterred, the Duce felt emboldened. Mussolini understood that the League was powerless. He knew Britain and France were unwilling to risk war. He calculated correctly that Ethiopia would be sacrificed to appease fascist Italy. In Addis Ababa, news of the League's weakness spread. Sanctions were toothless, diplomacy a mirage. Ethiopia was isolated. Yet Haile Selassie refused to surrender. He continued to fight, believing that if Ethiopia shed enough blood, the conscience of the world would awaken. The League of Nations had promised collective security. Instead, it revealed collective hypocrisy. For Africans, the message was clear: European powers would not defend an African state against aggression. The dream of international justice was shattered in the deserts of Ethiopia. The League of Nations, created to prevent war, had failed its greatest test. Ethiopia's cries for justice were drowned in political compromise and colonial self-interest. And as diplomats debated in Geneva, Mussolini's armies tightened their grip on the Horn of Africa. While Ethiopia placed its faith in international justice, Mussolini placed his faith in machines of war. Italy prepared to unleash the full power of its modern arsenal, an arsenal Ethiopia could scarcely imagine. On October 2, 1935, Mussolini announced to his nation, Italy was at war. For him, this was not merely conquest, it was destiny. A new Roman Empire would rise, carved out of Africa with blood and iron. With a thunderous voice, the Duce called upon Italians to sacrifice for glory. Factories worked day and night. Soldiers were conscripted, trains loaded with war supplies, and ships filled with men and steel crossed the Mediterranean to East Africa. The Italian military machine was formidable. Over 500,000 soldiers would be deployed. Modern tanks, armored cars, and heavy artillery gave them unmatched firepower. Above them roared the Regia Aeronautica, Italy's air force, with bombers and fighters capable of raining destruction on Ethiopian positions. And hidden among the arsenal lay the most sinister weapon of all, poison gas, a weapon banned by international law, but one Mussolini intended to use without hesitation. Alongside Italian divisions marched colonial legions. From Eritrea and Somalia, thousands of Askari soldiers were conscripted. Many fought with courage, others under coercion. To Mussolini, they were pawns in his imperial gamble. Italy's strength wasn't only in its modern weapons. It also lay in its ability to exploit colonial manpower. But this also revealed the irony of fascism's empire: Africans forced to conquer fellow Africans. The cost of war was staggering. Billions of lire were funneled into the campaign. Italy, already struggling economically, poured resources into weapons and logistics. Yet Mussolini believed conquest would pay for itself, through Ethiopia's land, resources, and prestige. Ordinary Italians were told to give gold for the fatherland. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, and coins were collected to fund Mussolini's imperial dream. The propaganda was relentless: sacrifice now, glory forever. By late 1935, the Mediterranean swarmed with Italian convoys. Tens of thousands of men crossed the sea to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The invasion was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. In Eritrea, Marshal Emilio de Bono assembled the Northern Army, tanks, artillery, and 200,000 men prepared to descend upon Tigray. From the south, General Rodolfo Graziani, known for his cruelty, massed his divisions in Italian Somaliland, ready to strike toward the Ethiopian heartland. Even before the first shots were fired, Italy waged psychological war. Planes dropped leaflets promising prosperity under fascist rule, warning of annihilation if Ethiopians resisted. Loudspeakers blared propaganda in Amharic and Somali. To Mussolini, the war was not only to be fought with bullets, but with fear. Across the border, Ethiopia prepared as best it could. Haile Selassie's army lacked modern weapons, but it was fueled by faith, patriotism, and a fierce desire to remain free. The emperor watched the Italian build-up with grim determination, knowing that Ethiopia faced not just an army, but a modern empire armed with the deadliest tools of the age. The stage was set. Italy's war machine stood poised to strike. Against them, Ethiopia prepared to fight with courage, tradition, and the hope that justice would prevail. The world's oldest Christian empire now faced the world's newest fascist empire, in a struggle that would echo through history. While Italy prepared with machines of war, Ethiopia prepared with spirit, tradition, and an unyielding will to defend its sovereignty. Theirs was not merely a military struggle, but a holy war for survival. Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Though his nation was poor in weapons, it was rich in courage. He summoned his generals and governors, calling every province to arms. His word spread like fire. From the highlands of Tigray to the plains of Oromia, from the mountains of Shoa to the deserts of Afar, Ethiopians rallied under the imperial banner. Ethiopia's strength lay not in modern arsenals, but in tradition. Many warriors carried spears, swords, and shields, weapons that had defended their ancestors for centuries. Others had rifles, some captured from earlier battles, others purchased from European traders decades earlier. Few were modern, and ammunition was scarce. Some rifles dated back to the late 19th century. In contrast to Italy's tanks and bombers, Ethiopia's arsenal seemed hopelessly outdated. Yet what Ethiopia lacked in steel, it made up for in spirit. Faith became the shield of the Ethiopian army. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church blessed the struggle as a sacred defense of Christian civilization. Priests marched with soldiers, carrying crosses into battle, sprinkling holy water, and invoking divine protection. For many warriors, the belief that God was on their side gave them courage to face an enemy whose technology seemed insurmountable. The mobilization was vast. Ethiopia could summon hundreds of thousands of men, though most were farmers who had never seen a modern battlefield. Communities sacrificed food and livestock to sustain the fighters. Women organized supply chains, while elders rallied villages with songs of patriotism. Ethiopia's mobilization was both military and cultural. The people saw this not just as the emperor's war, but as a struggle for their very existence. Haile Selassie had tried, in the years before the invasion, to modernize his army. A small number of modern rifles, artillery pieces, and armored cars had been purchased. But international restrictions on arms sales left Ethiopia starved of supplies. Some nations, fearing Mussolini's anger, refused to sell Ethiopia the weapons it desperately needed. In truth, Ethiopia was fighting not only against Mussolini, but against the silence of a world that denied it the tools of defense. But spirit was a weapon of its own. Ethiopia's warriors, bound by ancient codes of honor, pledged loyalty to the emperor and the cross. They vowed to fight until the last drop of blood was spilled. For them, this was not only about territory, it was about honor, faith, and identity. As Mussolini's forces closed in, Haile Selassie finalized his war councils. He divided his army among trusted generals, assigning them to defend Ethiopia's frontiers, north against Abono's forces, south against Graziani's invasion. The emperor knew the odds were against him. But he also knew that Ethiopia had one advantage Mussolini could not measure, the will of a united people who would rather die than surrender their homeland. With spears and rifles, with faith and unity, Ethiopia braced itself for the storm. The people stood ready to resist an empire armed with machines of death. The battle between tradition and modernity was about to begin, and the world was watching. On October 3, 1935, Italy struck. From Eritrea, Marshal Emilio de Bono led an invasion force of 200,000 men into northern Ethiopia. It was the opening move in Mussolini's campaign of conquest, the rebirth of Rome through the destruction of Africa's last free empire. Artillery roared across the border, pounding Ethiopian positions in Tigray. The Italian columns advanced cautiously, moving slowly but methodically. Mussolini had instructed de Bono to avoid reckless charges. Instead, it would be a war of steady attrition, machines grinding down men. Across the ridges and valleys, Ethiopian scouts watched the columns roll forward. For the first time, they saw the full scale of Italy's arsenal, armored vehicles, aircraft, and endless supplies. It was a sight both terrifying and galvanizing. On October 6, de Bono captured Adigrat without serious resistance. The town fell quickly, a symbolic first victory for Italy. Italian propaganda trumpeted it as proof of fascist superiority. In Rome, Mussolini celebrated. The invasion had begun well. But in Ethiopia, the war was only beginning. Despite the Italian advance, Ethiopian forces were not passive. Guerrilla raids struck supply lines. Small units harassed Italian columns, vanishing into the highlands. They knew the terrain, every ridge, every valley, and they used it to their advantage. Ethiopians understood that they could not match Italy in open battle, at least not yet. But they could bleed them, slow them, and remind the world that Ethiopia would not fall quietly. By October 11, Italian troops entered Adwa, the site of Ethiopia's historic victory over Italy in 1896. To Mussolini, this was a symbolic triumph, the stain of past defeat was erased. For Ethiopians, however, the occupation of Adwa was a wound to their pride, and a call to arms. Marshal de Bono advanced slowly. He established fortified camps at every step, wary of Ethiopian counterattacks. His caution frustrated Mussolini, who demanded swift victory. But de Bono knew the highlands were treacherous, and the Ethiopian army had not yet revealed its full strength. In Rome, the Duce grew impatient. He wanted lightning victories for the headlines. De Bono's deliberate pace clashed with Mussolini's hunger for glory. By mid-October, Ethiopian forces under Ras Siem Mengesha engaged the Italians in Tigray. The clashes were fierce, warriors charging with spears, rifles cracking across valleys, priests chanting blessings as men fell in battle. After Tembien, the next test of will came at Amba Eridam. Here, Ras Mulugeta Yegazu, minister of war and loyal servant of Haile Selassie, assembled nearly 80,000 men. Their task, to block the Italian advance deeper into the Ethiopian heartland. For Mussolini's army, it was another step toward conquest. For Ethiopia, it was survival. Amba Eridam was no ordinary battlefield. It was a natural citadel, rising steep and impregnable. Ras Mulugeta believed its slopes and ridges could protect his men from Italian artillery, and that the mountain itself was a shield given by God. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, however, had learned from Tembien. He encircled the mountain with more than 125,000 troops, supported by artillery and aircraft. He knew the Ethiopians fought with courage, but also that courage alone could not withstand his arsenal. The plan was simple: bombard the mountain until resistance cracked. For days, Amba Eridam shook under constant bombardment. Shells smashed into ridges, tearing apart positions. Planes dived, dropping bombs and clouds of mustard gas. Warriors coughed, burned, and fell, but still they clung to the heights. Despite unimaginable firepower, the Ethiopians fought back. From the cliffs, they sniped at advancing columns. Cavalry swept into Italian flanks at night. It was resistance born of desperation and faith. By late February, Badoglio ordered the final assault. Waves of Italian infantry scaled the mountain. Ethiopian warriors, outnumbered and outgunned, fought hand-to-hand with rifles, swords, and daggers. Screams and battle cries filled the air. Then disaster struck. Ras Mulugeta's camp was hit by shellfire. The minister of war was killed, his body torn apart by explosions. With their leader gone, Ethiopian resistance faltered. When the battle ended, Amba Eridam was soaked in blood. Thousands of Ethiopian fighters lay dead across the mountain. But Badoglio's forces were not finished. Survivors who fled down the slopes were bombed and gassed from the air. Villages sheltering the wounded were burned. Mercy was denied. The Italian victory was complete, but it was purchased with cruelty that shocked even some of Mussolini's allies. In Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie was devastated. Ras Mulujita had been one of his most trusted commanders. The fall of Amba Eridam was more than a battlefield defeat, it was a shattering of faith in Ethiopia's ability to hold against Mussolini's war machine. The Battle of Amba Eridam was both heroism and massacre. Ethiopia's warriors proved their courage against impossible odds, but Italy's modern weapons and merciless tactics crushed them. The road to Addis Ababa now lay more open than ever. Yet Ethiopia's spirit, though battered, was not broken. Ignored in 1936, but destined to echo when the world plunged into a greater war. When Addis Ababa fell and the emperor departed into exile, it seemed Ethiopia was lost. But deep in the highlands, the war was far from over. From farmers to priests, from ex-soldiers to noblemen, a resistance was born, the Arbegnoch, the patriots. The Arbegnoch were not a formal army. They were scattered groups bound by loyalty to Ethiopia's freedom. They hid in forests, struck Italian convoys, ambushed patrols, and melted back into the mountains. For every village burned by the occupiers, a new band of patriots arose. Life under Italian rule was brutal. Fascist settlers seized land, Ethiopian culture was suppressed, and thousands were massacred after attempted uprisings. But repression only fueled resistance. Every atrocity carved deeper hatred, and stronger resolve. The patriots fought with whatever they could find, old rifles, spears, even farm tools. They knew the land, the valleys, and the mountain trails. To the Italians, they were ghosts, appearing without warning, striking with precision, and vanishing into Ethiopia's vast terrain. In every region, leaders emerged. In Gajam, Ras Imre Haile Selassie rallied thousands. In Tigray, warriors harassed Italian garrisons relentlessly. In Shoa, young commanders inspired bands of fighters to resist against impossible odds. The Arbegnoch were not only men with guns. Women risked their lives smuggling food, hiding fugitives, and passing messages. Priests offered blessings and sanctuaries. Farmers concealed weapons under plows. The patriots thrived because the people stood with them. To crush the resistance, Italy turned to terror. Entire villages were razed, families massacred, leaders executed. Chemical weapons, already used in the open war, were unleashed on mountain hideouts. Yet the more the occupiers tightened their grip, the stronger the patriots' spirit burned. For years, the patriots endured. They were hunted, starved, and outgunned, but never broken. As Europe drifted toward another world war, Ethiopia's fighters kept the flame of independence alive. They proved that conquest was not the same as submission. By the late 1930s, the world shifted. Mussolini drew closer to Hitler, and Italy plunged into a new global conflict. Ethiopia's suffering would no longer be ignored. Soon, the patriots' sacrifices would converge with global war. The Lion of Judah would return. The occupiers would face the consequences of their empire built on cruelty. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War ended with occupation, but not defeat. For Ethiopia, freedom lived in the hills, in the courage of the patriots, and in the unbreakable will of a people who refused to bow. Their fight would outlast Mussolini's empire. Their defiance would inspire Africa's generations to come. You've just watched another powerful chapter from the Chronicles of African Wars. If you love Africa's untold stories, of courage, empire, and resistance, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next battle, the next hero, or the next moment that shaped our continent's destiny. This is the Chronicles of African Wars, bringing history to life, one story at a time.